Good afternoon and welcome to our virtual webinar, Fighting an Economic Calamity and Lessons for the Future. I'm Michael Strain, Director of Economic Policy Studies here at AEI. I'm honored to host a discussion on the current economic crisis facing our nation with Senator Marco Rubio, Chair of the Senate Small Business Committee and one of the congressional leaders who's been working the hardest to address this crisis. This virtual webinar will have a straightforward format. After my brief introduction, Senator Rubio will offer 10 minutes or so of remarks. Then I will have a few questions for the senator, and he and I will have a discussion about the economic challenges facing our nation and what Congress can do and should do to address them. We will take a couple of questions from you all at the end, and we'll adjourn at 3:45. So thanks again so much for joining us. If you have a question for Senator Rubio, you can submit it by email to mariana.mitchell@aei.org or by using the hashtag AEIEconTalks on Twitter. Both of those coordinates are listed on the event's webpage. I'm honored to be joined by Senator Rubio. And Senator, thanks so much for being here. You need no introduction, so my introduction will be very short. Senator Marco Rubio is the senator from Florida, served in local and state government, including as Speaker of the Florida House before being elected to the United States Senate in 2010 and re-elected in 2016. He serves on the Senate Committee on Appropriations, the Foreign Relations Committee, the Special Committee on Aging, as acting chair of the Select Committee on Intelligence, and most important to our discussion, as chairman of the Senate Committee on Small Business and Entrepreneurship. He was a driving force behind the creation of the Paycheck Protection Program, which in my view is the most important component of the CARES Act passed in March and commonly referred to as the Phase 3 economic recovery package. So again, Senator Rubio will offer some remarks and then we'll go into a discussion. Thanks so much, Senator.
Thank you. And I'm not sure I'll even need the full 10 minutes to kind of set the table. First, thanks for the invitation and the opportunity to do this. Just as a general thought, I think that the events of the last 2.5 months have in some ways, in many ways, I should say, sort of revealed what's important and what matters. And I think things that we've taken for granted for a very long time have suddenly become prominent and paramount. So as an example, I was thinking today about the threats that potentially exist to our food supply, not because the food doesn't exist, but because the ability to package it at a meat processing plant, the ability to get it to market is impeded by things we hadn't even thought about. And I think we often take those sorts of things for granted. We think that our food comes from the grocery store. That's where we buy it from. But it began way before that with the people who produced it. And then the issues as well of so many of the things we take for granted in our lives, from the ability to interact with others to the need for a country even as powerful as ours to be prepared for the worst case scenario on issues of real consequence. And all of it has come to a head. I also think it's been revealing. If you think about some of the responses and reactions that we've gotten, and I think history will view this point as a time, not just as a time of great fear and uncertainty, but also as a time of tremendous private sector response. So as an example, if you look at what the private sector has done, mobilizing supply lines away from one product and towards, first it was ventilators and obviously personal protective equipment as well. If you think about how our doctors, unfortunately, with so many cases coming in, have improved outcomes for patients, not because of some new medical innovation, but because they applied their expertise to do things sometimes as simple as the position a patient lays, and in other cases, a combination of different treatments and drugs that were, whose main purpose was another ailment, but taken together have served a positive purpose. By no means does that diminish the human suffering, the death toll of people who have lost loved ones in this pandemic. But I think it is also a testament to what an important role our civic community and our private sector plays in our national strength. I think if you project moving forward, there is a couple things about this pandemic that I think will serve as a hinge point in history that will forever change our behavior. Number one is that I do think it's revealed some vulnerabilities in parts of our supply chain in this country that people are going to want to examine, not just because of the pandemic's impact on our country, because I think we're going to enter an era where you're going to see a growing number of countries begin to protect their supply chain. So as an example, already 8 or 9 of the major economies in the world have designated medical equipment and pharmaceuticals as a national priority authority and have on occasion placed restrictions on the export of these products and devices abroad. Likewise, I think a lot of people were shocked that we were so dependent on foreign sources of production for things as simple as masks and gowns to protect our personnel on the front lines, on the medical front lines of this pandemic. So I think there's going to be a natural sort of reaction to that. And I'm also very curious to see what happens in the EU. And that would have an impact as well on our economy ultimately, because depending on how things turn out in the EU, you could foresee where forces within Europe will use this as an opportunity to sort of become more nationalistic and less pan-European moving forward. But that will ultimately have an impact on our trade and commerce from a transatlantic point of view. And then obviously the situation with China has gotten more difficult, both in our politics and also in our geopolitical and diplomatic realm. And I've always said that the relationship between the United States and China will define the 21st century. So it's a moment where I think a lot of things are changing, though we can't fully anticipate what those changes ultimately result in. But I think I'm pretty comfortable in saying that the world and our country, in both economic and political realm, are going to be substantially altered after this pandemic passes, no matter how it turns out. And I think that the challenge for those of us in public policy is to ensure that our response to it is appropriate, that in essence, we address whatever problems it revealed, we confront any challenges that it presented, but also not that we don't overreact to it. And in the process of that, create damage to our country. So it's going to be a unique time in public policy, and one that I hope we'll get right for the sake of our children and the future of our country. So I know I look forward to answering some of your questions about the particulars of what we've done and what might happen moving forward. But I guess I close with this, and that is there's a huge debate going on in this country, and like everything else that happens these days in our politics, it's almost become impossible to have a reasonable conversation about a topic. Almost everything turns into a divisive us versus them environment. Now it's down to whether you wear a mask or whether you want to open or not open. These are all false choices in many ways, like the opening or not opening. The answer is that we cannot ask Americans to continue to live under the restrictions that they're facing right now. It would also be highly irresponsible to tell everybody to go back to the way things were in the early part of March, because we know that given the fact that there is still no cure for this disease, would be a dangerous situation. So the truth of the matter is that we are now entering an era where we're going to have to learn to deal with this virus, try to diminish and mitigate the risks that it poses, especially to the most vulnerable, as much as possible, even as we try to engage in some normalcy of putting kids back in school and Americans back to work. There's no roadmap for it. No one's ever done it before. No one can tell you they have a manual on how to do it in a country as large and as diverse as this one. But it's one of those things we're going to need to figure out. And one of those things where I think federalism actually serves us quite well, because it allows local communities the opportunity to not just influence decisions because they're closer to those governments, but to craft a way forward that makes sense for their state, for their county, for their city. And I think in that sense, federalism really is a benefit to us in this response and in this regard. So these are just some kind of thoughts in general that hopefully set the table about where my mind is on a lot of these things, and certainly look forward to answering the more detailed questions that you have.
Thank you, Senator. And that sets us up for a discussion, I think. I want to talk about some of the specific issues that you raised about resiliency and about our relationship with China. But I want to get to those in just a minute, because something that you said really stood out to me, and I think it's a question on a lot of people's minds, and it'd be helpful, I think, for people who are listening to get a better sense of how you're thinking about this as someone who's really immersed in these issues and who's leading the Congress's response to them. You refer to this as a hinge of history, and I know that that's certainly one view. Another view that you hear, and you hear this from some members of your own party, is that this is a terrible situation for sure. There's lots of suffering right now, both on the health front and on the economic front. But hopefully we'll have a vaccine coming relatively soon. We'll have some medicines coming relatively soon. We'll have a strong recovery from this in the summer and in the fall. And we'll look back on this in the rearview mirror a year from now as a really difficult situation. But it's something that's kind of largely in the past, and we'll continue on with where we were, roughly speaking, in December, January, February of this year. Why do you view this as such a kind of watershed historical moment rather than as a really difficult situation, but one that won't fundamentally change American life?
Well, it'll fundamentally have an impact on American life because it's going to have an impact on the rest of the world. So as a perfect example, there are developing countries in Africa and in the Western Hemisphere who, if they face a huge surge in infections, it will create very significant problems. It could even threaten the stability of governments. It could have a humanitarian catastrophe of epic proportions. And so I think that's first and foremost, that will have an impact. I think there's issues going on already in European politics, and there are some countries in Europe that are going to look to the EU and say, in our time of need, the EU was not able to do enough. In the time of need, everyone forgot about the EU and started closing their borders. Other countries who have been dramatically impacted and don't have the sort of cushion that America has to slowly turn and react to it. I think in the Asia Pacific region, you've seen nations like, for example, Australia become very forceful in confronting China, both at the World Health Organization and in the larger context. And that most certainly is a development that we hadn't seen in the past. So I think there are a lot of things going on around the world that will ultimately have an impact on us. As an example, again, is if you look at pharmaceuticals in Europe, many of these countries who are also important to us in terms of what they produce. If in fact those countries designate them as nationally protected industries and begin to sort of narrow down or sort of clamp down a little bit on their ability to freely export, that will have an impact on the United States and on the rest of the world. So we are interconnected economically and geopolitically with a host of other countries who are going to have a much more difficult time recovering from this crisis, even in our own backyard in the Western Hemisphere, in the Caribbean, where all of these nations are not just dependent on tourism, they're heavily dependent on American tourism, which may not return for the better part of a year, and the impact that will have on their own economies and what that could mean, both in terms of migratory flows, the rise of transnational crime, the stability of their governments. So no matter how well we weather it here domestically, we will be deeply impacted by these events nationally, internationally. That will have an impact on us. And then even here domestically, I do think that there are some potential trends here in terms of the consolidation of some businesses, assuming many small businesses will struggle to get back online. You can see certain industries further consolidate. And then I also think that for a lot of Americans, whether you're 18 graduating from high school like my daughter or 21 graduating from college, there's real uncertainty about what the next 2 or 3 years looks like for you, especially if you're 21, leaving college and trying to enter a workforce that is at this moment sort of retrenched a little bit. So there's a lot to think about here, and I don't think anyone has a perfect prediction about how it's going to look. That America's not going to fail, it's not going to fall apart, but it's going to be impacted and therefore changed in some way by the events of the last few months.
That's very helpful. So let me ask some questions about current policy, and then we can move on to discuss the future policy. I want to just kind of throw the floor open to you for a minute. No one in Congress did more than you did to create the PPP program and to get that into law. Let me just ask, how do you think it's going?
Well, I think the program has been an enormous success, especially when you judge it through the lens of it was put together in just a handful of days in an emergency situation. It was massive. It had never existed before. The administration had about 6 days to implement it. That on April 3rd of this year, Friday, April 3rd or April 4th, early the 3rd or the 4th of this year, that first Friday in April, it was the first time ever that any banker in America had ever taken a PPP application, that any borrower had ever filled one out, and that the SBA had ever processed one. That to this point, over $500 billion have been put in the hands of small businesses, over 4 million small businesses across this country to keep attached to workers. When you judge it through the lens of all of that, you would say that the program has been an enormous success. Has it had glitches? Of course, any program of that size and magnitude, it does. But we're now in this program where the biggest issue is not the application or how long it's taking or so forth. The biggest issue has become whether 8 weeks is enough time for employers to spend that money on payroll, or whether some need 12 or 16 weeks because they're hiring at a different pace and scope. So the goal of the program was pretty straightforward, and that was to protect paychecks. We wanted to provide small businesses who did not have the liquidity to do this to maintain as many people on payroll as possible in the midst of an economic shutdown. In many of their cases, their doors were closed. In others, they were only partially open. And the hope was to keep as many off the unemployment line as possible. And by some estimates, 30 to 40 million payrolls have been supported by this program. Obviously, this pandemic is now, the restrictions on business are different in different places. Some places are opening faster than others. Some industries were able to utilize these funds better than others. But ultimately, I think I take comfort in the fact that our unemployment rate right now would be significantly higher were it not for the PPP, the program being in place. And on that, I would say it's been very successful and by far the most successful part of the CARES Act.
So I agree that it's been extremely successful. One of the one of the challenges with PPP has not been the actual legislation. It has not been the way the program was structured by Congress, but it's been the way that the Treasury Department has implemented the program, Treasury and the Small Business Association. There's been some question as to whether or not regulations have worked against congressional intent. For example, the regulation that 75% of any amount of loan that's converted into a grant be spent on payroll expenses. That's not in the statute. It is in the regulation. Another example is the kind of chaos around which businesses who took out loans would be audited, what criteria would be used for those after the fact audits, things of that nature. As you think about how the program has been implemented, is there any role for Congress in renewing the program, or even the next time it needs to be re-upped in terms of its funding, or really the next time any sort of legislation touches it, to try and put some measures in the next round of legislation to give additional guidance to Treasury and SBA about implementation with an eye towards some of the challenges that we've seen?
Yeah, so the 75% number is not in the statute, but clearly the purpose of the program was to incentivize the use of that money for payroll. It's the reason why there's even the provision that it would become a loan. That's why the forgiveness was in there, because it was a further incentive to use the money to pay workers as opposed to simply taking it for other purposes. So whether it was 75 or 70 or 65, some standard would have had to have been set in terms of how much of it to spend on payroll. We kind of left that open-ended because we wanted there to be some flexibility to adjust for whatever the market conditions were. So I think there's two issues. The first is the 75% number, which some people say is too high, and others have made it work perfectly fine. And then the second is 8 weeks. And that is that you have to spend all this money on payroll within an 8-week period. And what some businesses are arguing is we can't do it in an 8-week period because we're having trouble rehiring our people, or we may be able to rehire everybody, but it's going to take us 12 weeks or 14 weeks or 10 weeks. I think that second point is one that there's a very strong consensus at this point that we want to add to it. And basically, if you want to know why it came to 8 weeks, we were appropriated $350 billion. We were told that's how much money we had for PPP. We went out and basically estimated what is the private sector non-government payroll in America, and we divided that by the number, and it gave us about 8 weeks of payroll. So that's kind of where the number was set. By and large. But obviously now there are businesses, for example, that are starting to reopen their doors. And if they had another 4 or 5 weeks, they could actually go ahead and rehire everybody. But if they have to spend it all, or had to spend it all 4 weeks ago, they're going to have to return some of that money, or they're going to have a loan on their hands. So it doesn't make a lot of sense to me at this point. We also couldn't predict how long these closures were going to be. I mean, at the time that this was being dealt with in late March, no one knew this was a 15-day problem, a 30-day problem. It was impossible to predict it. So I think that part needs to be fixed, and there's strong consensus for it. On the actual percentage of payroll versus non-payroll, I don't think we've ever misled anyone that this was the Paycheck Protection Program. It was designed to provide funds to keep people on payroll. It was not that doesn't mean that there aren't other needs that are legitimate. It just means this program wasn't designed for those other needs, and it was very difficult to calculate how much money it would take to meet those other needs anyway, because overhead costs are much harder to calculate on a business by business perspective. But that's basically the gist of it. So right now there's about $100 billion of funds that have not yet been tapped into. So the application process for PPP has slowed down. And I think there's two reasons for it. Number one is the beating that some have taken for taking these funds in the press has been, companies have been beat up for taking some of this money. And the other is some level of uncertainty about what would be forgiven, about whether you could actually use it in the time frame that you've been described, or even if you were eligible for it. And I hope that the recent decisions from Treasury have cleared up the forgiveness part and the certification part about who actually qualified. The beating part, that's a little bit tougher because, it doesn't surprise me that not only this program, but the other program that's been set up by the Fed and Treasury has been underutilized because companies have seen the tremendous punishment that is inflicted upon them in the public square if they take money from one of these programs. And we've seen some large companies return the money and then lay off 10,000 people as opposed to keeping them on payroll. So I think that's been a big factor here. Some of this PPP shaming is something that's been a factor in here.
So let's go with that. So during the shutdown period, which I completely agree, and the kind of fog of war conditions that all this was worked out in, can't be overstated. Didn't know how long it was going to last. Didn't really know what the needs were going to be, and the idea of just kind of freezing the economy in place as it was on February 1st, keeping workers attached to their employers, making sure workers didn't go on the unemployment rolls and push the unemployment rate up and continue to get paid with the hope that they would have a job to snap back into when the economy reopened. All that I think makes perfect sense and was the right approach from a policy perspective to designing the legislation. We've now moved into a different phase. I think as of this morning, 49 states were in some stage of reopening. And as states reopen, I think the policy needs for economic support are going to change. We were in a world where the problem was that a restaurant or a bookstore was going to have 20% of normal revenue. We may now be in a world where they're going to have 60% or 80% of normal revenue. So that's a significant improvement. At the same time, they can't really operate with a 20% or 30% loss. While that's happening, we're also going to need to see some reallocation of workers across industries. If you're a worker and you work for a concert venue or a stadium or something like that, just to take an extreme example, it doesn't make sense for you to continue working for that stadium if no one's gonna call you back to work for the next 6 months or whatever it is. So we need you, the economy needs you to go get a job as a delivery driver or something like that. So the goal of keeping workers attached to their employer as of February 1st is still an important goal for millions and millions of workers, but it's not as important of a goal as it was when Congress was putting in place the Phase 3 CARE Act. All that being said, as a backdrop, how do you think about the next phase of small business and mid-sized business support? How do you deal with the problem? Oh, go ahead.
No, I think that's a really good point. So one of the things I've said is, one of the things we should be cautious about moving into the next bill is not trying to solve the problem that's immediately before us, but rather trying to anticipate as best as we can what it's going to look like by the time, what the world's going to look like and our country's going to look like by the time this bill is law and signed and being implemented. Because this has moved and developed and evolved so quickly that by the time this bill is ready to go, whatever bill it is we're working on is ready to go and is being implemented, the problem has substantially changed. And so we're not gonna be able to guess 100% right. So it's sort of, we have to have some parameters, but at the same time, we can't be too specific because then we don't have the flexibility to adjust to new dynamics. I also think it's very industry dependent. So as an example, tourism, hospitality in particular, is going to be the first one in and the last one out of this crisis. Because even if tomorrow you reopened a major hotel on Miami Beach, as an example, it's still not a moment where people are going to be flying down there because a lot of the things you would come down there for, other than the weather, is not going to be in place. And even if it were, you may not be able to any longer afford to take that trip because you've been out of work or you're uncertain or your business is taking a hard hit. And so you don't have that kind of disposable income at your fingertips. So there's a lot of unknown here. Even if you open things, I'm pretty confident people are still going to go buy groceries and put gas in the tank. What I can't predict is how much they're going to spend on consumer goods how much they're going to spend on leisure and travel over the next 6 to 8 months, because a lot of that is driven both by public fear of being infected, but also because of economic realities. So I think we have to be more flexible about what the needs of a small business is, and we're going to have to be flexible enough to take into account the different needs of different industries. So as an example, you outlined, you don't have to rehire the same number of workers, but I'll give you an example. There's a restaurant chain down in South Florida. It's not a national chain, but it's down in South Florida, and they're using PPP to rehire all of their workforce at this point, because they are, number one, because they know their employees by first name and they want to bring them back and don't want to lose them to other sectors. But number two, because they anticipate that each and every week business will climb, and they don't want the need to outstrip their ability to meet it, even at 50% restrictions, which they're facing in the 2 counties in South Florida. PPP worked for them. For other industries, it might be harder. You're a seasonal tourism sector, and you don't really start hiring until September. And by then, you don't know what your bookings are going to be. Those workers probably are not going to go back and work in those places. They may not reopen like they normally do that time of year. But those workers are in the sector. And then you mentioned public venues and things of this nature. Sure. I mean, I would imagine many of those workers are being reallocated, even as we speak, to different parts of the industry, because there's really no way for them to predict, even if they're allowed to operate, they're not going to be able to because of some other restriction that might be in place. So you're right. I mean, it's kind of hard to tell what the needs of small business is, because the small business sector in America is extraordinarily diverse, both in their business model and on an industry basis, and in many cases, even geographically. So I think coming up with something that helps small businesses not just survive, but be able to restart under this new normal, almost like if this economy is in the process of somewhat reinventing itself for the foreseeable future, how can we provide the most amount of assistance to those businesses that have the opportunity to reinvent themselves, which might involve operating potentially a smaller operation with less employees and maybe even less overhead.
So is the way to think about that then, that the next phase should be less about payroll and trying to solve the problem of filling the 20 or 30% revenue hole that many businesses will face, something like that? Is that kind of the way you're thinking about it, or are you thinking about it a different way?
I think that's a little bit. I mean, so I still think there's a payroll component to it, but there's certainly, in many cases, some of these businesses might be behind the curve on the rent and their overhead, so that they're trying to make up for the 2 months where maybe they weren't able to pay rent, but they still have that liability. In other cases, depending on the industry, they're going to have to spend some significant amount of money on making their location COVID compliant. I mean, depending on where you live, there are all kinds of new requirements now in place, whether it's sanitation requirements, plexiglass separation, and so forth. There are costs associated, not just with bringing workers back to work, but being able to invite customers in. And that's certainly not part of their budget going in. I mean, none of these businesses have ever had to spend the kind of money they may now have to spend simply to comply with local requirements from a public health perspective. So that is a cost that we think, I personally have argued, that is a cost that should be included in the payroll cost, because you can't hire people unless you're able to provide them the equipment and the conditions where they're going to be safe. So there's a lot to unpack here. And what we're in the process of doing now is sort of taking as much input from as much of the small business community as possible, so that all of these sorts of unanticipated factors that we may not be thinking about, we're hearing about them. So that's really what we're using this time for, is to sort of learn about what they think their business is going to look like over the next 4 to 6 months, and trying to come up with ideas about how we can be helpful in that regard.
So let me build on that. So I think that the kind of basic posture of Republicans in Congress and of the administration is, let's wait a few weeks and see how the phase 3 legislation and spending is working out. We don't really know what's going to be needed next, and we need a little more time to figure that out. Let me use that as an opportunity to ask you, just in general, what are your expectations for the U.S. economy this summer and into the fall and winter, and maybe even for the rest of the year? The Congressional Budget Office is forecasting that the economy will shrink significantly at the end of 2020 relative to the end of 2019. That the unemployment rate will be over 10% in the fourth quarter of this year. Of course, these forecasts are very difficult to make because they're very dependent on assumptions about what happens with the coronavirus and what happens with vaccines and medical technology and things of this nature. Kind of the fog of war of policymaking. But I think it would be helpful for people to know your general sense. What does the U.S. economy look like throughout the end of 2020? Do you think that there will be the need for sustained fiscal support of the economy, for many more months?
I think there's going to be the need for some level of support for several months, and here's why. Even if tomorrow morning they announced we have a cure for the COVID-19, and so no one needs to worry that much about it, you still have industries that are going to take time. So, for example, I'll just use my home state of Florida, which is very dependent on international travel. It'll be a while before international travel returns, because even if things might be getting better here, the countries that people are coming from may not have gotten better. Number two is the economic impact has been widespread. So someone who was making $100,000 a year and had planned a vacation this year is suddenly going to say, well, I need to recover from 2 months of lost wages, so I'm not going to spend money on vacation this year. I'm going to spend it sort of rebuilding our economic lives. Likewise with big events, conventions, and large gatherings. Even if there was a cure tomorrow, it'd be very difficult to turn around and pull this off in the constrained period of time that are available. And obviously, we're not going to have an announcement tomorrow morning that there's a cure and all the problems are solved. So what I think you're going to sort of see here is a steady improvement, but not a dramatic overnight one, because there's a long tail to this that still is out there, and it will take time for some industries to come back. If you're a small hotel, or you're a large hotel for that matter, and you depend on X number of your rooms during a time of year being taken up by cruise passengers who are overnighting before they get on the cruise tomorrow morning, those cruises aren't coming back for a couple months. So you're still going to have vacancies even if everything reopens tomorrow. The psychological impact, even if you open up these restaurants, there are people that are not going to go out the way they once did because they're afraid to be infected. They're afraid to get sick. So there's a lot of factors here at play that go beyond simply just the disease to actually some of the lingering impacts. So I anticipate we'll see lingering impacts for some time. I think some industries will come back much faster than others, to be frank. But nonetheless, I mean, look, I'm a big sports fan, so I don't say it just because of this, but in a lot of these college towns, they depend on those 6 games a year in the fall where all the hotels are booked because of college football, and then later in the year because of graduation. They have no idea if they're going to be booked. Maybe it's only 3 of the 6 games and that are booked, and therefore they have to make assumptions and decisions on the basis of that. And a lot of it is just not known. We just don't know if there's going to be a second wave, how consumers are going to behave in light of all the uncertainty, and frankly, what local restrictions will look like. So I wish I had a better answer on some of this, but I think part of it begins by saying we don't know. So we have to try to take in as much information, make well-informed, in many cases, guesses about what we think lies ahead, and then craft public policy to try to address some of it. But I think it would be an enormous mistake to say we know for sure, pour a bunch of money into it, and then figure out later that we poured it into the wrong thing, and now it's all tied up and can't be used for something else or be repurposed.
Yeah, and an enormous mistake, it sounds like, in your view, to bank on the best case scenario being the one that materializes. I agree with much of what you said. What do you think is the appetite among congressional Republicans to offering sustained fiscal support for economic recovery well into toward the end of 2020?
Well, I think the first is there's a recognition that no amount of government support can replace 100% private economic activity. Not even a country with this GDP, with this amount of spending capacity and borrowing capacity for that matter, can sustain that level of spending and do so in a way that replaces what the private economy could do. I think our hope largely has been the view was if so many key players in your economy collapse, then when the conditions are in place for some level of recovery, there won't be an economy to recover. Because if enough places close down, and the contagion, it's not just a small business that closed down, it's the landlord that lost the monthly rent, they also begin to get impacted and so forth. So I think there's a recognition that we're going to have to do more. But I think the question is really, it's about weaning, and how much do we need to do on a quarterly basis until we are at a place where you no longer need to provide that level of support. So this isn't really about trying to deny what's necessary for the economy to turn around. It's more of the recognition that no matter how much we spend, it can't replace the private economy. So we want to provide enough to ensure that there is a private economy to recover, but you don't want to provide so much that ultimately you realize you didn't make a difference, and in the process maybe even did more harm than good by spending this money that was borrowed. I would say this about the debt, which is a big deal to me, and I care a lot about it. There is a difference between sort of systemic spending that's built into the baseline of a budget and something you do on an emergency basis. I don't think we had a choice but to do something, because if we had not, you could have all sorts of political, societal implications for the country. Not to mention, you could lose some of these domestic capacities that we're going to need to rebuild the economy in the first place. But I also don't think we should go around assuming that we can continue to pour money into the economy and that that's a substitute for private economic activity. It's not. So I think there's an appetite to do more, but I think the sense is that more has to be more specific, more tailored, and more targeted than it was in the first couple bills.
That's helpful. Let me turn now to the subject of resiliency. You referenced this in your opening remarks, and you published an opinion essay in the New York Times at the end of April on this subject. And I would encourage everybody who's watching to read that, because I think it's very thoughtful, and it was an important contribution to some of the policy debates that are happening on the right. In that essay, you wrote, over the past several decades, our nation's political and economic leaders, Democrat and Republican, made choices about how to structure our society, choosing to prize economic efficiency over resiliency, financial gains over Main Street investment, individual enrichment over the common good. I hear that argument more often now than I used to from conservatives, and I wanted to just ask you to reflect on that and to let people know what are some of the specific choices you think our nation's leaders have made that prize economic efficiency over resiliency. What are over the course of the 1990s and the past 2 decades, if there are 2 or 3 specific choices that you think were wrong, what do you think those are?
Sure. Let me begin by saying this. One of the reasons why I'm such a supporter of capitalism is because it will always lead to the most efficient allocation of capital, right? Capital is going to flow to the most efficient, where you're going to get the most efficient result, the best product at the best price for the consumer and the profit for the business. And generally, that's the right place to land. Every now and then, however, the most efficient outcome is not necessarily in our national interest. So I'll give you a couple examples. It may be more efficient to rely on China for 70 to 80% of the active pharmaceutical ingredients and many of the key drugs in the generic marketplace. But I'm not sure that that's in fact, I'm pretty confident that is not long-term in our national interest. It may be more efficient, for example, to rely on China for a significant percentage of the rare earth minerals that this nation needs to develop technologically. I'm not sure that in the long run, however, that is in our best national interest. So I think this really begins by identifying what are industries that are not just key to the 21st century, but that are key to our national interest. And it's not just in the domain of national defense. It is also related to the production. Interrelated with this is that these are industries that create stable jobs, which in my view is one of the most important obligations we have, is to have an economy that provides dignified work. Because dignified work is not just the money you make in your pocket. There's more to the American dream than just money. It's about being able to be productive, get up in the morning, feel like you're making a contribution, being fairly rewarded for it. And as a result, you're able to contribute to your community, your families are stronger, and so forth and so on. So I start looking at industries, and I would say industries like telecommunications, industries like rare earth minerals, but also some of the other manufacturing capabilities. I would say to you that we should be grateful that this nation still retains some manufacturing capability that we were able to repurpose to make ventilators, or we would have had a real struggle on our hands in terms of providing what at the time looked like could be a catastrophic shortage of this equipment. And we know this because we know nations that do not have that capacity are now trying to buy off of us the old ventilators or whatever surplus capacity we may think we have. So I think that the notion, though, is not that we're entirely going to have all of this here in the US. There are some industries, frankly, where we're not going to be able to return them to the United States wholly. So then the question becomes, if an industry can't be here, then you at least want to have enough diversification in the international supply chain so that you're not so heavily reliant on one nation for so much of it. So as an example, the second leading exporter of personal protective equipment to the United States is Mexico. And the fact that they were continuing to produce that in the pandemic helped quite a bit. So I think that it's not just a realization we're coming to, it's a realization that many nations are coming to. And I think the ideal outcome is if we identify a critical industry for our national security or our national welfare, and we don't have a domestic capacity in that, then we should at least try to be a part of an allied capacity that is diverse enough so that in a time of shortage or in a time of conflict or crisis, if it's not made in the US, at least it's made in Germany or in France or in Canada or in Mexico. On the pharmaceutical front, Puerto Rico has a long history of being a key place for pharmaceutical capability. And it's been lost over the last few years because of some policy changes. The ability to return some of that to Puerto Rico is a 2-for-1. It helps rebuild the economy of a territory that right now is facing a huge economic calamity, and it also creates a domestic capacity in that realm. So there's a lot to do in this regard, but that's the way I view it. And I think if you talk about telecommunications, if you look at the Made in China 2025 plan, they've identified the key industries of the 21st century. Some are at the very high edges of the production chain, but they're, traditionally we've always thought of China as a competitor on the bottom rungs, but they're no longer seeking to manufacture the component pieces. They're now trying to supplant us in 5G, in quantum computing, in artificial intelligence. These are industries that will define much of what's going to happen for the rest of the century. We have to have some domestic capacity, and we can't simply rely on efficiency decisions to drive that, because the Chinese marketplace is manipulated. They will always create conditions that make it in the short term more efficient to do it over there than it is over here. But in the long term, it makes us deeply vulnerable to being denied these resources in a time of potential conflict, and it gives them tremendous geopolitical leverage over us.
Let's leave China out of it, because China may be a special case. Let's concede for the sake of argument that don't want to be critically dependent on China for a whole bunch of important defense goods and pharmaceutical goods and things of that nature. What is the problem with having those supply chains in Vietnam or in other developing countries where we don't have as friendly of a relationship as we do with Canada, and they aren't as close to us as Canada or Mexico are, but where it's the best economic decision of the businesses, and they're not in a country that many people think we have an adversarial relationship with?
Well, again, I don't think that the way to view it, first of all, it's better that it be in Vietnam than to be in China, but you also want it to be diverse, because we ultimately don't want to ever be at the mercy of instability in Vietnam suddenly collapsing an entire industry or threatening us. So you want to have a diverse supply chain. To the extent that it's not possible for some component of that supply chain to be in the United States, you want it to be diversified, so that you're not one geopolitical event away from a massive disruption on something that's really important to the country. By the same token, I would argue that it's something that from a geopolitical standpoint, you ask yourself, well, what would the continent, what would Western Hemisphere look like if some of those jobs, just some of those jobs that are currently in Southeast Asia wound up in Guatemala and Honduras and El Salvador and produced better paying jobs? I think it would have the added benefit of dealing with some of the migratory issues that we've seen. It would have the added benefit of providing stable jobs and opportunity for people who instead today see themselves threatened by transnational crime. So I don't think there's anything wrong with our geopolitics aligning with this and saying, if the supply chain is not going to be in the US, are there things we can do to encourage it to be in places where we have an interest in it being, if it's not going to be here? And that's why, again, look, there are some impediments to why it can't be in Guatemala and Honduras, El Salvador, Haiti, and today, but it's certainly something that we should be thinking about. So I think the key is if the supply chain is not domestic, is it diverse? Is it furthering some other policy aim that we have in terms of international politics and that also serve the country? And these are, or is it in a country that's friendly and reliable to us? But the diversity part is really key, because the absence of diversity leaves you, and look, even in India is a major producer of some of this. And for a couple of weeks there, India was restricting the export of certain things that we needed for our response. And a number of countries have done so. Some have done it because they want to keep those supplies to deal with their own emergency. And some have done it, frankly, as geopolitical leverage. So that's why I think the diversity of supply chains is very important if it's not going to be a domestic.
But you've referred to this as a pro-American industrial policy. A kind of typical conservative free market view is that industrial policy doesn't work, and that it's very hard for the government to be able to effectively execute an industrial policy. The government doesn't have all the information it needs. It doesn't have the competence in order to do that well. How would you respond to that?
Well, I think if you're thinking about traditional industrial policy, which is that the government directs the private sector on where it needs it to produce and what it needs it to do and how it needs it to do it and who's going to get the contract and so forth, I think that's a valid criticism. What I'm talking about is more about creating incentives. In essence, ultimately, we're not going to have the government run factories and manufacturing capacity. But what we can do is, number one, we can create incentives like immediate expensing and others to make America an attractive competitor, especially, again, not in every industry, but in industries that we identify as critical to the 21st century and to our country. The second is that, so in addition to providing that, in some cases, the government is a customer. It can create demand for these products. So for example, the U.S., the military and the Veterans Administration were required to buy American or in their drug and pharmaceutical purchases, that would create a demand. Likewise, if the Department of Defense began to stockpile rare earth minerals sourced from the US and or an international consortium with our allies to mine for rare earth minerals, now you're creating demand, which is also an incentive. I don't think this is a policy that should be taken and applied across the entire economy. But there are, and it's important work in identifying which are those industries that are critical to our future. You also don't want this to be used as an excuse to intervene in every industry or be involved in every industry. But what I'm talking about is an incentive-based model where we make America more competitive. The 5G competition right now is a perfect example, and that is that the Chinese, through cheap debt, through domestic protections of the domestic marketplace, have put companies like Huawei at a competitive advantage over other countries that have left many of our allies with little choice but to turn over their 5G networks to a Chinese company. And so in my view, on that front, if it isn't a US company necessarily that does it, then some international consortium of allied countries with the same concerns that we have, that somehow come up with an alternative to it, but through the private sector. And so I think that's the difference here, is we're talking about an incentive-based model. We're not talking about the entire economy. We're talking about sectors of the economy that we believe are important capacity. Ultimately, though, I do know this: we have to have a manufacturing capacity in this country. We have to have the ability to make things, particularly things not just in high tech. We have to have the ability to make ships and airplanes and the sorts of things that you would need to be able to produce if, God forbid, we did have a conflict. And there are certain things that a country has to have the domestic capacity to do, and that, I would say, extends to agriculture.
And why is it important that America have that capacity and not Mexico, or not countries that we have a friendly relationship with?
Well, again, I think that it's possible that in some industries that you would want a consortium or a partnership, or I don't think you want to have all of your reliance be on any single country, because then you're at the whims of either who runs that country or some event internally within that country that disrupts that supply. I think it's very industry specific, but assuming that it's an industry of great importance, it's also, these industries are also a source of really good jobs, a good productive work for Americans, and enduring work, durable work that can provide a dignified living for millions of people. And that is a national benefit as well, because when people are gainfully employed in a dignified work that provides for them and for their families, it opens the door for those people to also be active members of their community, to lead the PTA, to coach the little league team. The absence of that kind of work becomes deeply corrosive, not just to the individual, but to the community that they're a part of, and ultimately to family life as well. And these things are critical to our national strength.
I know we're brushing up at the end of your time, and I've just noticed a bunch of things are beeping over here. I'm still getting used to using this technology, so I apologize for that. Let me just quickly close with one question from the viewer, and I think this is from your home state of Florida. You have spoken about the challenges facing the American middle class. Do you think the middle class is worse off than it was 20 or 30 or 40 years ago? And if so, what's the problem?
Well, I think that's a tough question for a country as diverse as the United States. I begin by telling everybody the same thing. That is, we can focus all day on all of our problems. And one of the things that's been special in America is that we've never been complacent. No matter how good things may be, we always think they should be better. And so I think that lack of complacency is one of the things that's made us special. And we should never be satisfied. That's what makes us unique. The second thing I would say is it depends how you judge it. I think there are many people in this country that are living lives well beyond anything their parents ever lived. And in many cases, I say this to people all the time, not to diminish our problems, but most Americans today, even those facing difficult circumstances, face a higher quality of life than the King of England or the Queen of England did 100 years ago, or because of some of the advances that have been made. So I think it's the way I best keep it in perspective is I ask people, if you don't like the way things are going in this country, who would you trade places with? Who would you rather be? And even now, in the midst of this pandemic, there's no nation on earth that I would rather be. In the case of the middle class, I would say this: there are today. I'll use my own life experience. My parents came to this country from Cuba. They practically worked their entire lives in the service sector. My father was a bartender. My mother was a maid. And no amount of retraining was ever going to turn my dad into a software engineer and my mother into some back office professional. They were able to own a home and they were able to retire with dignity. Two people with those same jobs today would struggle to attain the same standard of living that my parents did. Part of it is because there's new costs in the 21st century that didn't exist back then. And some of them we may consider luxuries, but I would argue to you that being connected to the internet is no longer a luxury. Ask the kids going to school from home because they can't go into the classroom. Some say having two cars is a luxury, but if you live in a community that doesn't have rapid transit, you need two cars so that both can get to work. That's not necessarily, that is by nature, the reality of it has been that as our economy has moved towards a more service sector, technologically based economy, people in those circumstances, the sort of employment that allows them to attain the standard of living my parents did, has become less available. It's one of the things that's put a premium on education. So we need to recognize that and understand that the answer is probably not to have more hotel workers getting paid more money, although there's nothing wrong with that. The answer is really to find how can we have industries in this country that produce different but comparable jobs that allow people to provide for their families the sort of dignified life that my parents were able to achieve without much of an education. And that's an important thing to talk about, and to point to, because the absence of it has political ramifications, has societal ramifications, and has economic ramifications. And that's the part that I really tried to focus on, is that in many cases is the cornerstone and key to our future as a country, is ensuring that for people that are not going to go get an 8-year degree or a 7-year degree in technology or some of these other fields, that we are an economy that is still producing jobs, not that's going to make them rich, but jobs that are going to allow them to have a dignified lifestyle and provide for their families and contribute to their communities. Because in the end, our country is more than just an economy, it's a society. And if elements of that society begin to fall apart for economic conditions or for some other reasons, it becomes really corrosive and difficult for the country to be successful.
I think we should leave it there. That's a good note to end on, and a challenge that I think everybody agrees is one of the right ones that need to be worked on, and the right goal to have. So, Senator Rubio, thank you for your leadership. Thank you for taking some time to speak with us today. And I hope that the next time you and I are talking, we'll be able to do it in the same room and not in
person with no mask on either. We're not one of these things.
That's right. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you.